Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here talking to you today. And as Jan just said, I'm going to focus today on the social dimension of music and music cognition. So the basic premise of this talk is that our experiences of and responses to music are inherently social. And I'm hoping that I will be able to demonstrate that through a few examples, empirical examples from my own work and also some of my students' work. So just to give you a brief outline of the talk, first I'll give you a short intro into music and empathy. What is empathy? How are they related to each other, music and empathy? Then the first study I'm going to talk about looks into spontaneous movement to music and whether trait empathy has something to do with that. Then I'll talk about music and cultural evaluations. Then about feelings of being moved by music and how that could be understood as a social, relational, emotional response. And finally, predictors of social connection in virtual concert settings. A very rough definition of empathy, like empathy researchers don't quite agree on a definition of empathy. So I'm just going to give you something which I guess a considerable number of empathy researchers agree on. So roughly speaking, empathy is a process by which we can both understand and feel what another person is experiencing. And it has both cognitive and emotional components. So the main emotional component is emotional empathy, which basically means just feeling the same emotion as you observe or perceive in another person. And that's slightly different from emotional contagion, where you might catch the emotional state of another person outside awareness. So emotional contagion is something that happens outside awareness, whereas empathy happens, or you are aware that your emotional response is the result of observing an emotional response in another person. Another emotional component is sympathy. So often when you experience empathy, you also, it's often accompanied by feelings of concern and compassion and sympathy for the other person. And the sympathy component is the component which is most strongly associated with altruism and helping behavior. So it's just emotional empathy in itself is not a good predictor of altruistic behavior. And finally, we have the cognitive component, which involves being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person, seeing things from their point of view, understanding how others think and feel. And of course, there's a bit of overlap between these three components. They also interact, influence each other. So in order to feel what another person is experiencing, you also have to understand what they're experiencing and so forth. Then one concept or phenomenon that I'll be talking about today in the context of quite a few of the studies I'm presenting is trait empathy. So that could be understood as a sort of an empathic personality trait. So it just characterizes an individual's general responsiveness to the observed experiences of others. One of the most used measures to measure trait empathy is this self-report instrument called the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, which measures 4 subcomponents of empathy. And these relate to these kind of cognitive, emotional, these components that I just presented. So one of the components is empathic concern, which refers to the kind of the sympathy component, other oriented feelings of compassion and concern. And then there's an additional sort of interesting component. This is interesting, especially from the perspective of music, this kind of fantasy empathy, which characterizes the tendency to experience empathy for fictional characters, like in books and movies, and how strongly you tend to transpose yourself or identify with the feelings and actions of these fictional characters. And that's something that we often do when we listen to music as well. We tend to imagine maybe some narratives, or at least we perceive some type of agency, whether that's real or imagined, in music. And this fantasy empathy might help us to identify or engage with those emotional aspects of music more strongly. Then there's the cognitive component, perspective taking, the tendency to adopt another person's point of view. And finally, personal distress, which is kind of similar to this emotional empathy component. So feeling the same emotion as observed in another, but this is kind of focused on negative emotions. So your own kind of self-oriented feelings of anxiety and unease if you see other people suffering. Okay, so maybe the ones to remember are the empathic concern and the fantasy ones, because those are the ones that I'll be mentioning throughout this lecture. So what do we know so far about music and trait empathy? Most research has a look at trait empathy in the context of music-induced emotion, so how that might facilitate emotional responses to music. It's one of the psychological mechanisms that's been proposed to account for the emotional effects of music, that we engage with music through some form of empathy or emotional contagion as well. So some of my own work and also others has found that people with high empathy, trait empathy, tend to report more intense emotional responses in response to especially sad and tender music. They also enjoy sad and tender music more. Our ongoing research also shows that we can see these differences on the level of physiology. So in skin conductance measures, we see that highly empathic people also react more strongly to sad and tender music. And also when we indirectly measure the induced emotional state using something like a judgment bias or a memory bias, we also see that people with high empathy seem to be more susceptible to, for example, sadness evoked by sad music. So they're actually feeling some degree of sadness as a result of listening to sad music. But moving on now to some other aspects of music, not just the emotional aspect, but looking at music and movement. So this is work conducted by Agata Zelikovska, who was a PhD student at RITMO, and I co-supervised her. And we did a study where we investigated individual differences in music-induced micro movements. Before going into the study, just a little bit about what we know from previous work about trait empathy and rhythmic coordination. So Josh Bamford and Jane Davidson, in their study, they found that people who score high on trait empathy, they adapt their movement faster to tempo changes in music. So they're better at changing their movement patterns to match the music. Also, it's been found that empathic perspective taking facilitates interpersonal coordination in a task that involves synchronizing streams of music. And from outside music research, we know that empathy facilitates something that's called the chameleon effect, where will non-consciously mimic the motor behaviors of their interaction partners. So empathic people are more likely to mimic or imitate these motor actions of others during interactions. But yeah, we still don't know that much about how trait empathy might affect this type of behavior, rhythmic behavior in the context of music listening. So this study aimed to explore individual differences in music-induced micromotion while participants were instructed to stand in a relaxed, comfortable position. So they were just asked to focus their gaze on a white cross, which was placed on the wall in front of them. They weren't given any specific instructions about moving or having to stay as still as possible, just that they should stand in a relaxed, comfortable position. And there were motion capture markers attached also in their body. So we were tracking their movements. And while they were standing there, they heard 4 EDM tracks. They were about 45 seconds long, as well as one track, which was just the beat, like a kind of an EDM type beat, but just the beat, nothing else. And there were 2 within subject conditions, which were, the order was balanced. So they either heard the music through headphones or through speakers. And there was a previous paper which was based on the same set of data, which just compared these 2 conditions to see in which condition people had more micro movement, and in the headphone condition people had more micro movement than in the speaker condition. So what were the individual differences that we looked at? So we had the Big 5 inventory as a measure of personality, the 5 big personality traits. Then we had the trait empathy measure that I just mentioned, interpersonal reactivity index. And finally, the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire, which measures the types of reward that people get from music listening. And our dependent measure that we were looking at was the average quantity of motion, which was basically the averaged velocity of all the markers, the motion capture markers in the participants' body, which are marked there. Then exploratory study, we had quite a few of these individual difference variables that we wanted to see whether they have an effect on movement. So we had to kind of come up with an analysis strategy that would be as unbiased as possible. So we divided our predictors into blocks. So we did like a sequential stepwise regression approach. Because one of the caveats that stepwise regression has, for example, is that it bases its selection of the best predictor variables purely on mathematical criteria, so it doesn't take into account any sort of theoretical aspects. So in order to sort of give the opportunity of more predictors to be entered in the final model, we divided the predictors into blocks, and we started with the more general one. So first we started with the personality traits, the 5 traits of the Big 5 inventory. In the next block, we had the trait empathy predictors. In the third block, the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire predictors. And finally, we also entered the liking ratings for the EDM stimuli that the participant heard. But out of all of this, the only predictor that was ever entered into the model was empathic concern. So it emerged as the only significant predictor, a positive predictor of the amount of movement in response to the EDM tracks, explaining about 12% of the variance in this kind of inter-individual variance in the quantity of motion. And of course, the stepwise method is quite prone to detecting false positives as well. So we did a confirmatory analysis as well, where we used the enter method to enter all the predictors into the model. And we still saw that empathic concern really a significant predictor of the quantity of motion. But additionally, there was an additional one, the Barcelona Musical Reward Questionnaire musical seeking subscale also was a significant predictor, but we kind of interpreted that as quite as being more trivial, since it did not appear in the sequential stepwise approach, and only when all these other predictors are entered in the model. Yes, so we also we looked at the sensory motor subscale of the Barcelona Musical Reward Questionnaire. So this is a subscale that has questions like, music often makes me dance, or when I hear a tune I like a lot, I can't help tapping or moving to its beat. And we looked at, again, personality and empathy predictors, and the same trait, empathic concern, also emerged as the only significant predictor of this sensory motor reward subscale. But nevertheless, I think we had a relatively small number of participants. I think 32 after all the, or 34 after all the outliers and missing data things were kind of removed. And we had a lot of predictors in relation to the number of participants. So there is this increased likelihood of false positives. So definitely more research should be done in this to see whether it can be replicated. But some careful interpretation of what this might mean. So we know from other research that trait empathy is associated with increased motor simulation when observing facial expressions or hearing action sounds. And we also know that beat processing involves action simulation at some level. So it is conceivable that trait empathy could also contribute to greater simulated context of beat processing or music processing. But that's something that's should be subject to further investigation and study. But at least this is kind of giving maybe some interesting food for thought for future research. Okay, moving on. So now I wanted to turn a little bit towards the perceived human agency in music. So we know that music is imbued with the science of human emotional expression and agency at multiple different levels. And we humans, we have an automatic tendency to mind read even non-human and virtual objects, such as moving geometric figures, as in the classic study by Heider and Simmel. So it's likely that we do something similar. Listen to music, especially considering that music conveys a sense of agency on so many different levels. So first of all, as intentional sounds organized and produced by a human agent. But also we can sort of generate or imagine a type of a virtual persona, which is somehow inhabiting the music, for example, in the form of narratives, where this imaginary protagonist goes through various kinds of experiences. And some interesting recent research has also shown that music can be perceived in terms of social intentions between either real or virtual agents, and that there are certain musical features that tend to predict these perceived social intentions. And finally, music emulates the expressive qualities of human vocal communication and movement. So there is also this mapping to human expression of emotion from the musical features. Right, so this now leads to this second study that I wanted to present, whether musical parameters can predict cultural evaluations. And this study was conducted by my master's student, Melvin Trider, who we supervised together with the social psychologist, Jonas Kunst from University of Oslo as well. And this was kind of inspired by some of our previous work. We found that music has the ability to influence implicit attitudes towards cultural groups. And also by the study by Couturier and Canon, who found that listeners are able to infer these social intentions from acoustic cues of instrumental duet improvisations. But how music may influence relations between members of different groups or culture remains an under investigated topic. So we know that music conveys emotions, emotional expressions, and also that we are able to detect these social intentions from them. But how might we then interpret, for example, unknown cultural groups if the only thing we know about them is their music? So that was what we wanted to investigate. So that's exactly the task we gave them. Yeah, like this is a piece of music from an unknown culture. Please rate this culture using these 4 different scales. So these ratings that we used, they were actually derived from the literature or research in this kind of intergroup relations and stereotype prejudice research. So perceived warmth and competence, they are the two main dimensions in an influential stereotype content model. Then this threat rating that we used, it comes from a theory called the integrated threat theory that posits that prejudice is a result of threat perceptions. And finally, following the literature on dehumanization, we also assessed how evolved other cultures were perceived to be as a function of their music. So we selected 30 melodies from 3 different MIDI databases with kind of folk music collections. And they were all presented at the same tempo, same key, well, either major or minor in C, and with the same timbre. And we try to kind of select examples that would not be recognizable in terms of the geographical origin, so that people would not actually associate the music with a specific culture or a specific geographical area. I'm just cutting it short. And there's another one. And so we had two experiments, and for the first experiment we recruited 52 participants for via Amazon MTurk. And they gave these ratings, these 4 ratings to the 30 different melodies. And then looking at the musical parameters that we extracted, we used the MIDI toolbox and the music information retrieval toolbox. So these were melodic complexity or originality, the number of pitch classes used in the melody, the distance between successive pitches or interval size, the number of note onsets within a set number of bars, which is independent from tempo, because tempo was standardized, and also modality. And what we found through some linear mixed model analysis with cross-random effects design was that warmth was actually predicted the best. So originality, interval size, melodic velocity, and modality were all positive predictors. So modality as a positive relation means major tonality, and if it would be negative, it would be minor tonality. And whereas then some of the same predictors were negatively predicting threat. And it's also interesting to see that this originality also predicted perceived competence and evolvedness as well. But yeah, in the second study, we then wanted to do some manipulation, some very, very simple manipulations just of tempo and of dissonance. So we selected 6 melodies which had the highest standard deviation in terms of the ratings of geographical location that the participants rated. So basically the ones that were the most difficult to guess where they are from. And we made 4 versions of each of these melodies. So the original and a dissonant one. And since these were just simple melodies, we had to kind of use super simple manipulations of dissonance. So we basically just moved 1 pitch class in each melody, either a semitone up or down, to create, in reference to the tone, either turning a major second into a semitone, or a perfect fifth or a perfect fourth into a tritone, depending a little bit of the note, the tone distribution for in the melody. And we also quantified the number of pitches that were moved, and the number of dissonant intervals that were generated in this manner. So I'm just going to play one example. And the dissonant manipulated version. And then we had slow and fast versions, so slightly slower and slightly faster than the original ones. And we had 212 participants. So we had a higher number of participants because we didn't want them to hear the same melody in different versions. So they only heard one version of each melody. Okay, so here are the results. So we found that the dissonance manipulation actually had quite a large effect in the direction that you would guess. So dissonance reduced perceived cultural warmth and increased the perceived cultural threat. And also the dissonance reduced perceived cultural competence and evolvedness, interestingly. What we were surprised by was that there weren't any interaction effects of tempo and dissonance. So we only saw the main effects. And also, yeah, we found quite surprising because I think we sort of hypothesized or predicted that when we are adding fast tempo to dissonance, then it will be perceived as more threatening, but that was not the case. Just that dissonance overall was found more threatening. Okay, so what we demonstrated here in a very sort of simple design is that musical parameters can directly shape people's evaluation of cultural groups. This is the first such study that we know looking at these kinds of variables, and people are able to do it in a consistent manner. It does have some implications for our understanding of musical communication, maybe perhaps expand our view of music as a source of social information, but it had considerable limitations, of course. So we had a very small set of musical excerpts with limited variance, limited number of musical parameters, and very simple manipulations. And as the most important limitation, I think these findings only reflect the responses of Western enculturated listeners. So these were all kind of North American participants. So of course, these can only be applied to that set of participants. If we would take this stimulus set to somewhere else, I'm sure they would have totally different perceptions of warmth and threat and so forth. To maybe one of the sort of the core of the talk, which I really am most excited or interested to talk about today, which relates to this experience of being moved or touched as a distinct type of emotional response, which has not really been explored as a psychological construct until quite recently. So being moved is definitely not like a catch-all term for just being emotionally affected. But in the study by Menninghaus and colleagues, they asked people to rate. First they asked people to recall an emotionally moving or touching event, and then complete some ratings about that event. And what they found was that, I want to highlight some things from this figure, that often the types of appraisals that are associated with being moved are high in compatibility with pro-social norms and self-ideals. So there's something, for example, self-sacrifice or I don't know, reunion after a long time apart. These are some kind of common scenarios that are being moved when you are observing these types of events. But also music and other forms of art are able to elicit being moved. And the functions of this being moved emotion seem to be, or they are at least hypothesizing that the function might be to promote social bonds and to sort of strengthen these social relations or connections to others. Yes, I wanted to also mention this model called the Kamamuta model. So this is a theoretical model of describing this emotional construct. They use this Sanskrit term, which means moved by love, to refer to this emotion, because there are kind of varying terms that people are using across different cultures to refer to the same emotion. So they didn't want to use feeling moved or touched, even though that's often how people describe this emotion in English. But it basically refers to the emotion of feeling a sudden feeling of oneness, connection, and belonging with either a person, a family, a team, nation, or humanity, or the cosmos. So quite broad. This emotion is characterized by feelings of kindness, compassion, feelings of belonging, identification, shared responsibility, and sharing of resources. And they also argue that it's an adaptive psychological response that motivates pro-social behavior and social bonding. And it's commonly elicited by significant relationship events, acts of generosity, gratitude, and even cuteness. So if you see a cute baby or a cute animal and you go like, oh, I want to take care of that, they think it's part of the same emotional construct. Interestingly, if you remember the empathic concern trait, the subscale, it's actually consistent predicting these experiences of feeling moved or touched across different kinds of stimuli, so including videos, written narratives, own life events, as well as music. Music, what do we know about feeling moved by music? Well, Juslin and Laukka in their 2004 survey found that being moved was the fourth most common emotional response reported by people. Also, in the context of strong experiences with music, people often say that they were moved. And Vladimir Konechny, in his aesthetic trinity model, names being moved as one of the three central aesthetic responses to music. And also a hierarchical clustering approach of all kinds of different music-induced emotions suggests that feeling moved and touched form a distinct cluster of musically induced emotions. Okay, now to the study. So this is currently still in the process. We're just about to resubmit it for the second time, so hopefully it will be out soon. But we were interested in looking at the time course of feelings of being moved elicited by music and how it relates to perceptions of sadness, happiness, and beauty, feeling a sense of connection, physiological sensations, and musical and acoustic features. And we had 415 participants recruited, again via MTurk. They listened to 7 music excerpts. 3 were sadly moving and 4 were joyfully moving, based on a pilot experiment that we did. And then each excerpt was about 2 to 3 minutes long. Here's just a short example. One, the joyfully moving time. And we used 7 rating scales, and each of these were randomly paired with excerpt. Participants used each scale only once, so they only rated one thing for each of the excerpts. So they heard each excerpt only once, and they used each scale only once. And these were kind of 5-point Likert type scales, which they were asked to continuously change while they were listening to the music. So if their experience changed, they would have to move the rating. And these scales were feeling moved or touched, perceiving sadness in the music, perceiving joy in the music, feeling chills, feeling a warm feeling in the chest, perceiving beauty, and feeling a sense of connection. And they also completed a trait empathy questionnaire, the interpersonal reactivity index. Okay, so we averaged the time series for each scale song combination across participants. And before analysis, we had to detrend these averaged time series. We used a method called spline detrending, because when you're looking at cross correlations, curves might have quite high cross correlations simply due to the fact that they have some trends in common, and we wanted to look at more sort of short-term relationships. So just to illustrate how it looked like, so original data, and then after this spline detrending, and we also removed the first 10 seconds of each rating or of each excerpt, because you have always this increasing trend, which is basically when music starts, you are just kind of comparing silence to music. People are just kind of raising their response immediately, and that is generating already quite a lot of cross correlation between the curves. Okay, so here are the cross correlations with ratings of feeling moved or touched. So you see both before and after detrending. So even after this quite heavy detrending, we see very strong cross correlations for both sadly and joyfully moving music. So maybe to point out, the highest cross correlations that we saw were feeling a sense of connection associated with being moved, and also perceived beauty and chills. But we saw a different pattern for perceived joy and sadness in the music and how that was predicting feeling moved for the joyful and sad excerpts. So we saw that for joyfully moving music, it seemed that only joy, perceived joy, was predicting feelings of being moved, whereas for sadly moving music, both perceptions of joy and sadness were predicting feelings of being moved. Detrended, so these are the original curves, but just to kind of illustrate how the original curves, averaged curves look like. So you see here feeling moved in red, perceived beauty in green, and felt connection in orange, that they are quite following very, very similar lines. And here you see the pattern reflected by perceived sadness and joy and how they relate to feeling moved, and this kind of differing pattern between the sadly moving excerpts, which are the ones on the top row, and the joyfully moving ones are on the bottom row, where in the joyful ones, the feeling moved curves are quite closely following the perceived joy. Yes, and also we looked at trait empathy. So we had to kind of average over the individual time series to get like an average rating of feeling moved for each participant, and we correlated that with empathic concern and fantasy, and we used random effects meta-analysis to estimate this correlation across different songs. And empathic concern was related to overall feeling moved, and both in the case of sad and joyful music excerpts. And fantasy empathy to a lesser extent, it actually was only related to being moved by joyful music. And finally, the musical features that we analyzed, actually what we found. So here again, the top 3 are the sad pieces and the bottom 4 are the joyful pieces. So we only found kind of consistent patterns for the joyfully moving pieces, where we saw that sort of root mean square energy, so loudness basically, was quite a consistent predictor, spectral flux as well, and roughness. So we interpreted these as being kind of markers of arousal evoking features in music. So it seems that acoustic features that are relating to arousal are good predictors of feeling moved in the case of the joyful music excerpts. But for the sadly moving excerpts, we didn't find any consistent pattern. It was not the same case as for the joyful excerpts. Okay. Little summary. I think I went through all these already. Just to mention that these results that we got had a very similar pattern of correlations as a previous study that looked at touching kind of pro-social videos. So it seems that music or being moved by music has very similar characteristics as being moved by these kind of touching social scenario videos. Moving on a little bit to this discussion. So feeling moved has had the highest cross correlation with feeling a sense of connection. And it seems that also in the case of music, these appraisals or experiences of closeness or affiliation seem to be associated with feelings of being moved. We kind of left this feeling a sense of connection quite open on purpose, because we thought that this sense of connection, that it could be construed as existing between the listener and another agent like the music, the performer, other listeners, or perhaps you in general. Or you could see this sense of perceive the sense of connection between real or virtual agents perceived in the music, just like in the Couturier and Canon study. So we don't know exactly where listeners are perceiving this or feeling this connection, and that's definitely something we should look into more in future research. But it may be that the feeling moved by music is dependent on experiencing music as somehow conveying pro-social intentions or perceiving musical events in terms of pro-social interactions between agents. But that's also something we should look into more. But at least it's indicating that that could be the case. Okay, one last super quick study. So we shouldn't leave this out because this is kind of very current, relating to the pandemic that we all just experienced over the past 18 months or so. So last year, early summer, we conducted this study where we wanted to investigate people's experiences of social connection in these virtual concerts, because suddenly everyone was isolating in their homes. There were no concerts, no interaction happening. People are feeling lonely and trying to find ways of connecting with other people. And we wanted to see how effective virtual concerts might be in that. And this study was led by Dana Swarbrick, my PhD student. We had some musician partners and kind of industry partners who are organizing these virtual concerts, who are helping to distribute the survey. Just to go straight into the method, how we actually measured social connection in this study was that we made like an aggregate measure of, first of all, of feelings, so how connected participants felt to the performers and other audience members. And we took some items from this multimodal presence scale, measuring how much people felt like they were in the presence of others and how much they felt others were aware of their presence. And also these kind of social behaviors, so how much participants interacted surrounding the concert, how much they read comments or commented themselves or shared the concert or discussed about the concert. And we had English, Norwegian, German, and Spanish versions, which were distributed internationally. And we had 307 parts with full responses. They filled in the survey online, and the criteria was that they had to watch a streamed concert for at least 15 minutes. And this could be live streamed or recorded or live streamed and watched after it was live. So we just compared the different concert types. So real-time live stream or a live stream after it was streamed, and then pre-recorded concert. And surprise, surprise, we found that people felt the most social connection or experienced the most social connection in the live stream real-time concerts. And we also looked at the feeling moved, or the Kamamuta scale. So this is a slightly broader construct or broader measure of feeling moved, including also some appraisals about related to this sort of sense of connection. And there we didn't actually find any difference, surprisingly. But we did find that empathic concern predicted experienced Kamamuta and also experienced social connection in these concerts. And the last slide, so we did some exploratory analysis about factors that contributed feelings of social connection and also experiences of social presence and physical presence, and some important predictors in these different analyses are that audio quality was important, also coronavirus salience, so whether it was kind of mentioned and discussed during the concert by the artist. Performer interaction with the audience was important, level of attention, and also empathic concern as a personality predictor. Okay, I think my time is up now. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.